Thanks to Anna for inviting me to start off this course. We've been friends for many years. I helped in a small way to get her and Dr. Dubrovner off the ground with GBI 5 years ago. Hard to believe, in the old universe where we were actually physically in the same space in New York City, the first summer course at GBI. And I said then, and I will say again now, although now without a glass of nice champagne in my hand that we had at the reception that night. Anna remembers what I said, and I don't even need alcohol to say this, it's true. I'm really impressed, even more impressed now than I was years ago, with what Dr. Annalita and Dr. Dubrovner have been able to do, because there's really no other international course like this. In fact, the whole discourse, the global discourse in bioethics is really has changed because of this crisis. Some of you know that a couple of months ago, I was the co-host for the University of Pennsylvania of the the international bioethics meetings. We were all ready to have hundreds of people on our campus in mid-June, and about 3.5 months before that, we decided to go completely online. So I know how hard it is. We ended up having 700 people at that meeting with 3 or 4 hours of live stream events a day. So what I'm saying is I know how hard it is for Anna and Dr. Dubrovner to manage this, and for you also. It's a big adjustment for everybody. I will say one advantage, and I looked at the list of students for this course, quite impressive. And one advantage is, I think, that although we hope to get back to the physical world of Newtonian space for meetings, soon. One advantage of this is I think it kind of equalizes people from parts of the world who may not have been able so easily to travel to a meeting in America or Europe. So at our meetings in June, I think there were numbers of people there from countries in the Southern Hemisphere who might not have thought that it would be useful for them to go to a meeting remotely before, because they had the disadvantage of, compared to people from Europe and America, North America, they had the feeling that, well, they weren't really able to have the same equal role, but now we can. But hopefully in the new world, to emerge from this crisis, there will be more equality. And that actually takes me a little bit to my talk. So I will say also that bioethics is part of the crisis and actually has a voice in this crisis. And I think actually there's a tremendous opportunity for people who are interested in bioethics now. Maybe a bigger opportunity than there was a few months ago. So I called this talk Bioethics Before and After the Pandemic. Let me see if I can do a screen share. And let's see, so that's desktop. Let's see if I can share my slides. So I'm hoping you can see my slides. Give me a nod if you can. Yes. Now, what I really want to do is go to whole screen. Right, so you should see a title slide that says Bioethics Before and After the Pandemic. Yes, I'm getting some thumbs up. See, this is what I like to see, the faces. So I have a lot to say about bioethics before the pandemic. I hope that you have a lot to say about bioethics after the pandemic, because we're just trying to come to terms with this problem. I know we all have lots of thoughts and feelings about this. I will talk for, I hope not longer than 20 or 30 minutes, though I promise, my promises about how long I talk, if my students notice, are not reliable. We are trying to work our way through all this, and we'll try to explain to you why I think bioethics is so crucial in the coming years. Last fall, I published a book with My friend, Amy Gutman, who is the president of my university, the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. Amy is also a political philosopher. Many of you know her work, I think. If you read political philosophy in connection with bioethics, she's been interested for many years in access to healthcare and justice, theories of justice. And you may also know that Dr. Gutman was the chair of President Obama's Bioethics Commission for 8 years, and I worked for that commission as a senior advisor. We worked on a number of our reports together, and so it felt very natural for us to decide after that commission ended that we would write a book together, reflecting on our experience in bioethics and our experience with the commission. We have just completed for the paperback edition, which will be out this fall, an afterward chapter called Pandemic Ethics, because clearly there are issues now being raised for people in bioethics that we could not completely have anticipated. Oh, I think we did anticipate some of them in our book. There are some details now and obviously some new angles given the nature of this virus and the way that we interact with it that do raise new ethical issues. And actually, even this morning, there are reports that a major country is going forward with mass vaccination in the next couple of months, which is raising questions about international norms for doing vaccination of the scale required. And we may have time to talk about that. So we published this book, and a part of the book had to do with the history of bioethics. So in my fall course, which I'll start in a few weeks for my graduate students at University of Pennsylvania, I will spend a session or two talking about the relationship between bioethics and traditional medical ethics. I'll come back to that. But we have come to think of bioethics as roughly starting, modern bioethics, roughly getting started in the late 1960s. My old boss at the Hastings Center, the first freestanding bioethics institute, where I worked in the 1980s, my old boss, who died last year, Dan Callahan, liked to distinguish between prophetic bioethics, the way that bioethics got on its feet, and regulatory bioethics, which became, in a way that he wasn't happy about, I must say, the predominant way that people do bioethics. So prophetic bioethics is about sort of big philosophical questions. What are the implications of genetics, of solid organ transplants, of our ability to change ourselves, our bodies, our minds? These are questions that we still ask and that certainly have a place in literature. But in the mid-1970s, there were more and more legal cases, more and more government standards for bioethics. And so people in bioethics started shifting to what Dan called regulatory bioethics. Not completely, but it became very prominent. So I'll talk about some of this in the next few minutes. What you also saw, partly as a result of the shift to a more regulatory bioethics, more oriented toward laws and government standards and so forth, you also saw the demographics of bioethics shift. So in the prophetic era, you saw many more theologians. In the regulatory era that we're in now, you see many lawyers. And this is a reflection of the way that the conversation has changed. In the next few minutes, I want to touch on what I think are the four principal areas of the way that bioethics is mostly discussed now. Research ethics, both human and animal, clinical ethics, and I mentioned here already the Karen Ann Quinlan case in New Jersey, which I'll come back to, and of course, organ transplants. What I call laboratory ethics, or you could call basic research ethics. So for example, the beginnings of the debate about recombinant DNA, which continues through our conversations now about CRISPR and new forms of genetic engineering, and public health ethics, which was frankly not a big topic when I got interested in bioethics in the 1970s. Yes, I said 1970s, not 1870s. It was not a big topic, partly because many people thought that the era of infectious disease was over. In fact, the United States Surgeon General published a paper in 1971 in which he said exactly that. The era of infectious disease was over. Polio had largely been conquered. Smallpox, only 9 years later, was considered globally eradicated. And then within a year or two of the eradication of smallpox, we have the emergence of what has come to be known as HIV/AIDS. And now no one can say that the era of infectious disease is over. As a matter of fact, a new chapter in human history has now opened with the coronavirus and the disease COVID-19. So there are two ways to think about the history of bioethics. One way is to think of it as a continuation of traditional medical ethics, starting, some people would say, with Hippocrates, and then moving through people like Gregory in the early part of the 19th century, and others who wrote books in the 19th century about medical ethics. But most people, I think, in the field now think that modern bioethics is really different from traditional medical ethics. It's qualitatively different. That traditional medical ethics was about doctors creating rules for other doctors. It was a discourse that happened within the profession, within the guild, within the fraternity of medicine. And modern bioethics has introduced new voices, the voices of the patients or of the human subjects, or even of animals in a way, when we talk about the uses of animals in medical experiments. So I tend to think that there has been a qualitative shift from traditional medical ethics to modern bioethics, and I want to talk about that in the next few minutes. And then at the end, as I promised, to say some things about some of the issues in bioethics after the pandemic. So this is where I like to start when trying to talk about the way that medical ethics changed into bioethics in the 1960s. This is a textbook that was published in 1956 by Loyola University Press. Loyola University, a great university in Chicago. Beautiful campus right on the big lake, on Lakeshore Drive. And the professor who published this book was named Edwin Healy. And Dr. Healy was somebody who I presume gave lectures to medical students. He was himself a theologian, a Jesuit. But presumably, if you were a medical student at that time in the mid-1950s, and you wanted to learn about medical ethics, you might well have picked up Dr. Healy's book or gone to one of his lectures. So here's one of the cases in Dr. Healy's textbook from 1956, and this is about a woman who has a chondrosarcoma, and she asks her doctor, "Do I really have a cancer?" And the doctor says, "Your pains are due to arthritis. The pain you're feeling is due to arthritis." Knowing that she has time to prepare for death and wishing to spare her needless mental suffering. So this is the case that Dr. Healy offered us in 1956. Now, I discovered this textbook through an accident in the late 1980s, and it struck me because my mother in 1958 had a chondrosarcoma. This is a picture of my mother and me. I was about 5 years old. Fortunately, they were able to buy me a shirt after this picture was taken. And here I am in my mother's lap. This is from the New York Times in 2016. She died a few months before that at the age of 99. And they put her story in the New York Times Magazine, which she would have been very happy about. This is the only time I've had my picture in the New York Times, and it may be the only time I ever have my picture in the New York Times. A mixed blessing. I don't know, I never knew my mother like this, with two arms. wearing a sundress because in 1958, she was diagnosed with a chondrosarcoma, exactly the kind of cancer that is featured in Dr. Healy's case. And again, in his book published in 1956, My Mother's Case in 1958. She had to have her arm amputated, her right arm amputated at the clavicle. So as I say, I don't remember her with two arms. But what struck me about this case, besides the fact that this was exactly her disease, is that her surgeon never told her what her prognosis was. Now, as I said, she lived for another 50 years, 60 years, in fact. But he never told her that she had a 5-year prognosis, after which, if she didn't have a recurrence, they would consider her cured. In fact, she was cured, but she didn't know what her prognosis was. It was very typical in those days for doctors not to tell patients, perhaps especially female patients, what exactly their prognosis was. So this is, in case you're wondering, what's the solution to this case? If Miss A, Dr. B has this solution, if Miss A actually has arthritis, or if Dr. B is convinced that everyone at her age does have at least a mild case of arthritis, his answer is not morally wrong. Now that might surprise you. I wonder how many of you guessed that that was the right answer, that it was ethically acceptable for her not to be told what her disease was. Well, fortunately, you and I might be surprised at this result, but Dr. B gives us an explanation. Rather, Dr. Healy gives us an explanation for Dr. B's answer. And in short, what Healy tells us is that as long as Dr. B thought that some of her pains might have been due to arthritis, he didn't have to tell her that she had a cancer. His answer was not morally wrong, because if Ms. A really wanted to know what her disease was, she would have asked, are my pains solely due to arthritis? So as I like to say to my students, if you're going to see a doctor, you should know how to ask the questions in a very precise way. Maybe you have to go to law school to get an honest answer. So I assume this surprised you. And maybe it surprised you that my mother wasn't told what her prognosis was in 1958. Maybe these are unusual cases, but we have good reason to think that this was not unusual, that this was very common at the time. This is a survey that was done of doctors in 1961, which reported that 90% of doctors didn't tell their patients that they had cancer. That's 1961. Now, what's going on here? Because I think most of you would have been a little surprised at these results from the 1950s. And I think what we have to appreciate is that this was a very different world. It was a world in which there was tremendous excitement about polio vaccinations. It was a world in which penicillin was available to pretty much everybody who was in the developed world, at least by the late 1950s. It was a world in which there were very idealized views of doctors on television. I grew up with this show, Dr. Kildare. In the early 1960s, I could teach a whole course using an episode from Dr. Kildare, even though it was the early 1960s. And it didn't hurt that Richard Chamberlain, the young actor on the left who's still alive, was ridiculously gorgeous. And every boy and girl who watched Dr. Kildare, I'm sure, had a big crush on Richard Chamberlain. It was a very idealized portrait of medicine. Gradually, this portrait of medicine began to change a bit. And there are lots of ways in which this changed. The thalidomide tragedy was part of it. I'm sure you know about this. The early days of hemodialysis, or actually, first of all, peritoneal dialysis, then hemodialysis, which was in short supply. Americans began to learn that there really might not be enough devices for everybody. And this, of course, is what we've learned recently, that there may not be enough ventilators for everybody. So the idea of rationing and the idea that not every pill you take may be good for you, doctor's advice isn't always right. This really began, I think, to change attitudes about doctors and medicine, and brought, along with a lot of other reasons, including civil rights movements, it brought non-physicians into the conversation about ethics. And then in the US, we had this critically important case of this young woman who was for over 9 years in a persistent vegetative state. Her parents were given the authority to remove her ventilator. It was thought at the time by many neurologists that she would die within a couple of weeks. She lived with tube feeding for 9.5 years in a vegetative state. This gave a big push to what we now know as the Right to Die movement, and also to ethics committees. The court said that, really this did not need to go to a court of law. There could have been something called an ethics committee, a term they pretty much made up to deal with her case. So it wouldn't have to go into the legal system. So a few years after the Quinlan case, that earlier study that I mentioned was done again. And exactly the opposite results were reported. In the Journal of the American Medical Association, virtually all doctors said that if their patients had cancer, that they disclosed their diagnosis. So roughly between 1960 and 1980, there's a sea change in attitudes about doctor-patient relationships. And to me, this is a key to the beginning of modern bioethics. The Right to Die movement gets an odd kind of celebrity and tremendous publicity from the practices of Dr. Jack Kevorkian. I'm sure you know a lot about Jack Kevorkian and his deathmobile. It took the state of Michigan a while to figure out how to make what he was doing illegal. Finally, when he gave a lethal injection to a patient on national television. And by then, Michigan did have a law to cover Dr. Kevorkian. He went to prison. He was released a few years later when he himself was terminally ill, and he promised never to do what he had done again. Whether you approve of what Dr. Kevorkian did or not, it certainly gave a lot of impetus to the medically assisted death movement, and especially with this case, the case of Brittany Maynard, who had a very different appearance for this movement, who had a glioblastoma, a brain cancer, with her husband, decided that she did not want to die of her brain cancer, that she wanted to take her life when she felt still that she was possessed of her personality, and that she could say goodbye when she wanted to. She actually had to leave her home state in the US, California, and go to Oregon to accomplish her medically assisted death. And that moved the then governor of California to sign a bill that also made it possible to obtain medically assisted death in California. And that's been enforced for a few years. Now, again, whether you think this is good or not, and of course, in our book, Amy and I talk about Netherlands and Belgium and Switzerland and so forth. Whether you approve this or not, it shows that there has been a change in many countries and attitudes about medically assisted death. And just to give you the US example, by now, there are 10 legal jurisdictions in the US that have medically assisted death statutes, or in one case, a legal judgment that tolerates medically assisted death. To me, this is a major change in moral attitudes in a relatively conservative country, the United States of America. And yet, obviously, still enormously controversial in so many ways. For example, does depression count as a basis of suffering that would allow a medically assisted death to proceed? Big debate happening in Europe about this question. So I've talked about clinical ethics, especially around the medically assisted death movement. Now I want to move into research ethics. Many of you know this image. These are the 23 defendants in the Nazi doctors trial in what was then still Germany, in late 1946 through early 1947. These were 20 physicians and 3 medical bureaucrats who were on trial for engaging in or facilitating experiments on concentration camp inmates during the Second World War. And I will only say about this that many of these experiments were done at the behest of the military. I think it's not generally appreciated that the German Air Force was particularly interested in some of these experiments and sponsored some of the experiments that had to do, for example, with hypothermia and with leaving the aircraft at a high altitude, explosive decompression studies. So, as you may know, 7 of these people were hanged. Another number of them were given lengthy prison sentences. A number were acquitted. The judges, this was not a trial about medical ethics. Really, there's a lot of confusion about that, I think. This was a trial about murder. And only after the trial was pretty much over did the judges realize that there were no accepted, and they were shocked by this, that there were no internationally accepted rules for doing human experiments. So they decided to write their own, along with the judgment about the execution of 7 of these people and prison sentences for another number of them. They also wrote a 10-point code of ethics. And you may remember that the first sentence of this 10-point code of ethics, which we now call the Nuremberg Code, the famous first sentence is the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. And the code goes on. If you came to the University of Pennsylvania, took a class with me, we will walk through in great detail the other elements of the Nuremberg Code. But you can do that yourselves. There's a wonderful book about the Nazi doctors' trial that I commend to you by my colleague at the University of Kent, Professor Ulf Schmidt, called Justice at Nuremberg. It's a very powerful, very thorough history of the trial of the Nazi doctors that I recommend to you. So what effect did the Nuremberg Code have on the practices of doctors around the world? Did human experimental ethics change because of the Nuremberg Code? Well, in the words of my friend who died about 10 years ago, Jay Katz, who was at that time a medical student at Harvard in the late 1940s, the reaction of his medical school professors at Harvard, he said, was, well, the Nuremberg Code, that's a really good code of ethics for barbarians. But we're normal doctors are not Nazis. And I think it's true that until this paper by a Harvard anesthesiologist named Henry Knowles Beecher, attitudes in the West, at least, did not really change very much because of the Nuremberg Code. So Henry Beecher published this paper in the New England Journal of Medicine, in which he said, and I highly advise you to read this paper, that he had found easily 22 unethical published studies in the medical literature, including 2 that I'll mention, but I won't talk about right now, the Brooklyn Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital case, and another famous incident, the Willowbrook State Hospital case. But Beecher himself was not enthusiastic about what he called rigid rules governing human experiments. He thought the best protection for human experimental subjects was what he called the virtuous investigator, the good person. Even though Beecher himself ended up as the chair of Harvard's Institutional Review Board, their research ethics board, he didn't really like a lot of bureaucracy telling doctors how to do experiments. He thought that the best protection, again, was a doctor with good intentions. So, oops, I think I've lost my slides. Don't know what happened. I'm going to go back to my screen share, guys. All right, should be up again. Somebody yell at me, unmute yourself if they're not. My slides aren't up. Are we up?
I don't see your slides, sir.
Not quite yet.
See my slides. Okay. Now they should be up. Good. And whoever called me sir, thank you. That kind of, makes my day. I don't get that. I don't get that at home. I think people also know about the syphilis study. This absolutely rocked the country in the early 1970s when it was not a secret study. It was a very well known study in the United States Public Health Service. In the US, we're having a racial reckoning, as we are in many parts of the world right now, amid the coronavirus pandemic. This was also a racial reckoning in the 1970s. After the African American Civil Rights Movement, nonetheless, it appeared that there had been pervasive racism even in the public health system in the US. This led to a famous national commission, the first Bioethics Commission in the US, which made a number of reports, became federal regulations in the US. And their philosophical statement was called the Belmont Report, published in 1979. The ultimate statement that this commission made, appointed by the US government. And they articulated three principles: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice, which still to this day govern human experiments in the US and much of the world. They also asserted that there were differences, ethical differences, between research and therapy. Informed consent had to be much more careful in research. The goal of research, obviously, is not to cure the patient. The goal of research is to grow knowledge, sometimes at the expense of the patient, in terms of the patient's suffering. We thought, in the US at least, that these rules were working pretty well until about 20 years later, when this young man died in a gene therapy experiment at my institution. I was not there at the time. I was at the University of Virginia, but this really rocked the research establishment in the US. Gene therapy was just getting off the ground in terms of the experimental programs. When this young man died, 18 years old, really the whole world, that was, to the extent that other countries were participating in gene therapy studies, those studies were shut down. And so we had to go back to the drawing board and take another look at the way we're doing human experiments. And this seems to happen every 15 years or so. In 2010, it was disclosed that after World War II, the US Public Health Service, again, had engaged in experiments involving mental patients and prisoners, and even in a couple of cases, children in Guatemala, where Guatemala's own hygiene authority was participating in these studies and endorsed these studies. So we did this at President Obama's request. The commission, under my colleague Amy Gutman, we produced this report on the STD, sexually transmissible disease research studies in Guatemala in that period. So I'm moving on now to what I call lab ethics. I hope we all remember Dolly, the most famous sheep in the history of Scotland, maybe in the history of the world. Dolly, as you may not know, unless you visited the Science Museum in Scotland, is stuffed and on display. So Dolly was the first cloned mammal. It took these veterinarians at the Roslin Institute several hundred attempts to obtain a surviving mammalian clone. This got people very excited. This is how it was done, just to remind you, pretty straightforward. But you had to be a very skilled veterinarian to accomplish this. So again, this made the Roslin Institute famous. I hope you remember that Dolly was actually named after the American singer Dolly Parton. These male veterinarians at Roslin thought that was very clever because they obtained the donor cell from a sheep's udder. So as my late grandmother used to say, sometimes scientists are too clever by half. So this was the origin of Dolly and the first mammalian clone. This was really astonishing in 1996. And then in 1998, we had the isolation of human embryonic stem cells, which could be used for cloning. And I think this created a lot of confusion. The public debate about cloning, the public debate about the appropriateness of destroying some human embryos for stem cell research, those two controversies became confused and conflated. And it was, I think, somewhat unfortunate that these events happened within 2 years of each other. But there was tremendous progress, which also made people uncomfortable. The ability, for example, to turn somatic cells into egg cells, into ova, to make babies, done in mice, could certainly be done in people. This really worried people about what this could mean for the traditions of making babies, of family structures, of male-female relations. People are still very exercised and concerned about this. And it also raised the specter to many people, yet again, of eugenics. I don't really like the term eugenics. I think it masks so many of the important issues and differences. But these, of course, are images from the Nazi eugenics program, which really was inspired to a great extent by American eugenics. But then it seemed, people said, well, but we're already doing this. We're already deciding which embryos to implant in fertility clinics. 1978, the first test tube baby, and now the ability to screen for at least some traits. Some fertility clinics in some places guaranteeing the sex of your baby. That's actually not that hard to do. You can separate male and female sperm in the laboratory, but you can also predict eye color, skin tone, and so forth. Aren't we already, some people have said, well, aren't we just turning state-sponsored eugenics into consumer-oriented eugenics? Aren't we really doing the same thing? I have this picture of our kids from about 15 years ago. You can see we didn't have much help making them. We just did them the old-fashioned way. Maybe they could have been better if we'd used but the point here is, we seem to be revisiting these old questions about modifying human beings repeatedly. While I was at the University of Virginia, there was this story by a journalist friend of mine, Gina Colada, in the New York Times. Undergraduate women of a certain stature with certain standardized test scores were being offered tens of thousands of dollars for their eggs. You could even be offered money based on whether you were Asian, you want an Asian egg, or you want a Croatian or Slovenian egg. I don't even know, what this starts to mean anymore. But to me, what this says is that people take notions of race, which we don't really understand. Even the word race, I hate the word race, I have to say. It has caused more suffering than any word in the last 200 years. And we don't even know what we're talking about when we use the word race, yet we still do. So these are, modern companies, contemporary companies that will help you find genes that fit, which is an old eugenics term. The word fitness makes me very uncomfortable. This company allows you, again, to choose your eggs based on race, which, again, nobody knows what the word race means. We reduce it to skin color. That's not very reliable. But these companies are advertising based on these racial categories, which I think have actually virtually no basis in biology, but a lot of basis in sociology, unfortunately. And what's good for the goose is good for the gander, as my mother used to say. You can be a sperm donor and make money. That's a lot easier and more pleasant than being an egg donor. You can be an Asian sperm donor. Again, what the hell does this mean, really? But now we're in a new era, and I'll just wave my hand at one very fascinating area of laboratory work, the creation of organoids. You probably know something about this. These are tiny models of organs that can be grown up to the size of about a pea, and they reproduce some of the properties of the actual organ itself. They are a wonderful laboratory tool. But what if you put a tiny brain organoid from a human being into a rodent? Would you somehow be mixing species in a way that was not intended by nature. I have to tell you, the word species also is very vague. Like the word race, it's very hard to know what it means. And the truth is that nature has been mixing species ever since species got started, whatever species are. But this seems, again, to challenge our comfortable notions about the differences between groups of human beings. So I participated in this paper last year. Hard to believe it's less than a year. This is a paper in which, along with some brilliant neuroscientists and neurosurgeons at Penn, we reported on and assessed the issues, the scientific issues and the ethical issues involved in transplanting human brain organoids into animals. This is not a new debate. During the embryonic stem cell debate, this was a concern as well. What if you put neural stem cells from a human source into a rodent? Would you have a talking mouse? This experiment was proposed by a very distinguished stem cell biologist at Stanford, Irv Weissman on the left, and my friend Hank Greeley, also at Stanford, a law professor and ethicist, was asked by the university at Stanford to assess this possible experiment. The experiment was never done. But these are the kinds of debates we are still having. This situation and this situation raise very similar ethical issues. And then, worries about conflating rats and humans, creating hybrids. Could you create a new animal consciousness if you gave it the right kinds of human neural-based cells? And what if they somehow, their axons penetrated the rodent brain in just the right way? Plus ça change. So, of course, we had this an immense debate about CRISPR, a vastly more efficient way to do research involving chromosomal material. I just remind you that there are so many mental diseases for which we have no good drugs at all. Disorders involving schizophrenia and delusional psychoses, even depression, we don't have good treatments for these diseases. And it is hoped that someday CRISPR may help in alleviating some of these diseases. So apart from the ethical issues that I've mentioned about species and so forth, and species mixing, what is a human being? A lot of suffering could be alleviated someday, we hope, by this research. But it can only be done if we have money. So I have a friend who has had immune therapy for his kidney cancer at the University of Pennsylvania. His life has no doubt been extended by this immunotherapy. His bill for his immunotherapy for his kidney cancer was $16,000. That's one injection. Fortunately, he is an older person who has our insurance system called Medicare. It cost him zero, ultimately, out of pocket. But who will pay for this work? Even the drug companies themselves have no idea ultimately how they can pay. I can assure you the insurance companies right now, they're paying because there are very few cases and they like good public relations. Nobody knows how we're going to be doing this in the future. All these financial issues are coming up again in the pandemic. How will we pay for all these vaccines? How will we pay for vaccine distribution? So this takes me finally, after all this talk for more than 30 minutes, I warned you it would be long, to some questions that we're facing now in the bioethics world. Remember, this is only about a 6-month-old experience, 8-month-old experience. So people in bioethics are asking themselves questions like these. Are the standard methods for analyzing bioethical issues adequate for a new and intensified emphasis on public health? Public health ethics has not been a dominant factor in bioethical discourse. So ideas that there's a common morality from one society to another, the question about how states could enforce masking for requirements or requirements that people not associate in large groups during the pandemic. How much state power is appropriate here? What about when there is a vaccine, which there probably will be? We hope it'll be an effective one. There'll probably be more than one. Will vaccination be compulsory? Will people actually be forced to be vaccinated? Or will it only be mandatory? In other words, you will have disincentives not to be vaccinated. You may not be able to get into a restaurant if you haven't been vaccinated, or use public transportation. Will we tie you down? Probably not. But you could imagine there were situations in which that would happen. What new elements of familiar bioethical themes must be addressed now? When I started in bioethics 40 years ago, we talked in very abstract terms about the allocation of medical equipment. Now it's a real thing. International bioethics talks about benefit sharing. When we learn about vaccination, when we learn about vaccines from doing vaccine trials in the developing world, will we also make sure that everybody in the developing world ultimately has access to that vaccine? I think we have not been engaged enough in the bioethics world with the biosafety, biosecurity community. I have written about this over the years. I think we have to start a dialogue with people who do biosafety. We have not, for the most part. And a big issue here is the dual use of new technologies like CRISPR, but also dual use of new neurotechnologies, new brain technologies that I've written about. And finally, again, just to get the conversation going, there are people who are worried about vaccine nationalism, that the few countries that have the capacity to produce thousands of millions and hundreds of millions of doses of a vaccine may keep it to themselves. But I think we also have to worry about bioethics nationalism. Will different countries have different ways of selecting study subjects? We've heard already that China and Russia are moving along very quickly with vaccinations, according to evidence that they have not published. And I would just remind you that we have had experience with vaccinations gone wrong. In a world in which many people are skeptical and suspicious of vaccination, we do not want to have a situation in which people have reason not to trust a coronavirus vaccine. Many will not trust it anyway. We don't want to give them more reason not to trust it. And then maybe our whole methodology of doing bioethical analysis has to change. Maybe we have to emphasize more justice issues than we have before, rather than issues about informed consent. Maybe we have to think more carefully about, again, what's called in the international bioethics world, benefit sharing. So I will leave it at that, and I will stop my screen share. Some of you are still awake. Really happy to see that. And I'll ask you to unmute. And we have some time, I think, now until Anna stops me.
Could I ask you something? You mentioned that you don't like. Hi.
Hi, Nikki. Where are you from?
I'm from Ireland.
I love Ireland. Yes. Good.
Well, you're welcome anytime once the pandemic is over.
Once we can get there.
Yeah. Not now. You mentioned you don't like to use the term eugenics. Now that's kind of my big area of interest, and I'll be doing my thesis kind of on eugenics. So what kind of term would you use to replace the phrasing eugenics?
I don't know. I'm not smart enough to know that. I'm hoping that you will.
Steal your words.
Well, you have a young, supple brain, and I don't.
Debatable.
But look, here's the problem, right? In the case of the US, for example, what we called eugenics in the 1920s was not a racial-based eugenics. It was to call it eugenics. There was selection by the court, sanctioned by the US Supreme Court, based on traits like malingering or alcoholism, one generation of poverty after another, one generation of women having too many babies and so forth. It was racialized particularly in the Third Reich. But it was not necessarily racial eugenics. So I think we have reduced the idea of eugenics to a great extent to race. Now, you could raise the question whether people, parents, prospective parents, who get screened for diseases like Tay-Sachs or sickle cell, right? Are they engaging in a kind of passive eugenics when they screen out those traits from their prospective babies? Some people would say that's eugenics. I have a hard time thinking of that in the same terms as mandatory sterilization, or I have a hard time of thinking of that in terms of death camps to eliminate a class of people. This seems to me to be a very unhelpful term. But what term to describe it? This is hard. This is hard. But I think that your generation of people who work on these questions need to think about that.
No, thank you. That's really fascinating, because I've always just like clustered it into one, eugenics. But now that you
understandably,
kind of separated them all out, it really makes sense. Yeah.
Can I ask a question about bioethics nationalism and vaccine nationalism?
Please.
So this is actually the first time I've heard of these terms. I didn't know that like the split in our norms globally was this deep. So I'm not like, the depth of my question isn't as deep and as detailed as I would like it to be, but I'm wondering if you are sort of what you see for the future. Do you think that because we are sort of seeing 2 or possibly 3 like large and largely self-sustaining and self-sufficient like rods of power in the world, that we might see a sustained split in the way that these global communities in the West versus the East do bioethics? And if that happens, do you think that regulatory agencies might end up banning or limiting the access that their citizens have to medicines created on the other side of the world?
Well, actually, Juan, you said you didn't have good questions formulated. You actually had terrific questions. Those are great questions. So look, there are, you can count on one hand how many countries have mass industrial capacity to make hundreds of millions of doses of any vaccine, right? China, India, probably the top 2, Brazil, maybe the US, maybe Germany. So the concern is, again, that, as I said, that, will these countries actually share the vaccine? Now, this goes to corporate relationships that have been established, between a company that's headquartered in a particular country and investors who are headquartered elsewhere, right? And those investors might be countries like the U.S. government, or they might be a drug company that has officially has its base in another country, right? We don't know how this is going to work out, but what we do believe, at least, and what I'm told by the real experts in infectious disease, is that this virus is now endemic. There is essentially no place that doesn't have it. In order to stimulate the global economy again, so that there can be commerce in people and in goods, so that people can not be afraid to travel, right? Not be afraid to spread a virus on surfaces. There will have to be global vaccination. Now, that having been said, so what I'm saying is there is a big financial interest, right, in every in getting this done, including in the high income countries, to get their economies moving again. Now, this is with lots of qualifiers, right? One of the qualifiers is the first vaccines will probably not be as effective as later vaccines. Older people will probably not benefit from vaccination as much as younger people, based on what we know about previous vaccines. So there are a lot of obstacles here. And then to the end of your question, what if a vaccine is produced in one country that is used in that country massively in the next few months, but has results that are very worrisome? So that out of millions of people vaccinated, perhaps because there's a manufacturing flaw, hundreds of people die. Would for example, in the U.S., would the Food and Drug Administration prohibit the use of that vaccine in the U.S.? And then would Americans travel to another country to get that vaccine, right? Or somehow find a way to obtain it? These are all open questions. And we just don't know. But particularly to the sort of bioethics nationalism question, a couple of days ago, Dr. Fauci here in the US said, of the Russian vaccine that has been announced, well, we hope that it has been tested for safety and efficacy, but we don't know. Will different norms for getting over the first threshold apply in different countries? That would be a real change. So I could talk about this for a while because it's pretty much all I think about. What we do know is that historically there has been a lot of cooperation between countries, and my favorite example is back in the 1950s when Albert Sabin wanted his vaccine to be distributed. The Salk vaccine had already been distributed in the US. So there was largely a herd immunity to polio because of mass vaccination of children in the US. But there were polio epidemics in Eastern Europe and in Russia, Soviet Russia. So Sabin had permission from the US government to work with a laboratory in Moscow. And Soviet authorities gave those people that permission to distribute mass quantities of the Sabin vaccine in Soviet Union in the late 1950s, which was also taken to Hungary and to Poland and so forth. So we know there can be global vaccine cooperation, even at the height of the Cold War when we were threatening to blow each other up. So we can be hopeful that we can replicate that now. A problem is that, as you know, the polio virus targeted young people specifically and was harder to transmit than this virus. So there are some unfortunate differences, but we can hope that there could be cooperation.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was very informative. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kathy Lively. I'm in Florida. And I'm interested, you made the comment as to other methods of considering bioethics and the common morality, particularly looking at the masks. In Palm Beach
Exactly
County,
what I had in mind, Kathy.
in Palm Beach County, Florida, we had the mask mandate, and the community outrage was, I don't know, nothing short of pathetic. But I'm looking at how do we, from a bioethical perspective, encourage people? We're talking simple of wearing a mask. It's not comfortable, but how do we get there if we agree, and if it is correct that that will help erode the spread, stop the spread? As a bioethicist, how do we get that word out to the community, particularly here in the United States, it is so politically divisive?
No, so I did in fact have mask wearing very much in mind when I had that reference to common morality. Those of you who have not read my friends Tom Beecham and Jim Childress's classic textbook, Principles of Biomedical Ethics, you should, and you will see that they make an assumption that they call that there is a background common morality that their principles build on. And I think what we're seeing now is maybe this is an exception. Maybe maybe there's not a common morality about this, or it's not only a problem in the US, we have to say. There were, according to reports over the weekend, 17,000 Germans protesting, a very progressive country, in my experience, for the most part. So, and Britain also, right? So the common morality with respect to mask wearing, unfortunately, doesn't seem to be so common as you observe. Look, I think what we've learned from people who do public health ethics is that this can be done. Take the example of seatbelts. Seatbelts were installed in automobiles in the United States in the mid-1960s. And then but many people did not use them. And a concerted effort was made by the insurance industry to get people to use seatbelts, right? That was in their interest. Alcoholism and pregnancy, big problem for a long time. What we learned was that I learned this from people like my friend Ruth Faden, who's a famous public health ethicist. If you had multiple messages in multiple different media, not just on the bottle, but also a sign in the bar, not to drink if you're pregnant or you think you might be pregnant. You have to have we learn this from people who do public health communications. Unfortunately, that takes years, and we don't have years. So, we're not going to be able to fix this overnight. I do believe, however, as somebody who traveled in Asia for 20 years, post-SARS, I do believe that after this, over the next 2, 3, 4 years, people of a certain age, like me, people with certain background medical problems, young people, many young people will be wearing masks routinely. And so in certain situations. But I am not optimistic that we can do this in a few months. I think will be hard. And how can bioethicists do this? Bioethicists can't. But people who are expert in public health communications can be very helpful. And these are the people we need right now. It is extremely frustrating.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Really great discussion. Really good discussion, and enjoy the rest of the course.